Meet Roman von Ungern-Sternberg, a mystical Buddhist with a German name, under persecution by Russians for his Mongol Khanate that he just established. His crimes included walking around his reinstated imperialist Mongolian state, strangling old women, and boiling his own army alive that he didn't like. Now, how did this man get in such a confusing situation? First, we're gonna have to go back a few years to the days of the Russian Empire. Roman was born as Nikolai Robert Maximilian Freiherr von Ungern-Sternberg. Yep, I actually have no idea how they condensed that down to Roman, but sure. He was born in Austria-Hungary to a German noble family. Growing up in the German Baltic world of the Russian Empire, he developed quite the reputation for being violent, reckless, and overall just a bit of a knob. It is even said that at the age of 12, he attempted to strangle his cousin's pet owl out of rage. Alongside violence, he possessed many other ideas which were pretty peculiar for a child to share. Those strange ideas including the frank belief that bloodline, honor, and status were the natural order of the world. Sure, but then he also argued that nobles were born to command and peasants were born to obey. He, a noble himself, must have been chuffed coming up with that conclusion. His parents eventually pulled him out of school because he was being a bit of a hassle, as he kept smacking kids in the jaw, smoking cigarettes, and just breaking rules. The perfect conditions for raising your average child. But the obvious next step was for him to go to the military. And he definitely had a marginally better time there, as all of his violence was actually needed. Flash forward, it was now 1905, and it was definitely one of the periods to be alive in Russia. It was revolution time, and the Poles kept sacking German nobles since they had money and stuff. And our man Roman here was a German noble himself, so that definitely made his anti-poor people philosophy way more intense. He eventually graduated military school and was packaged off into Siberia. It was here that his love for both the nomadic peoples out there and Buddhism really began to bloom. The absolute dream combo for any Russian soldier at the time. He believed that nomadic peoples in particular possessed a warrior-like spirit that ceased to exist in modern Europe. Man, he would have loved right-wing edits on Instagram Reels. It is also said that he claimed to be a direct descendant of Genghis Khan himself. Although quite the bold statement, he supposedly had his reasons. One, because where he grew up, the Mongols did occupy that area at some point in history. That is crazy actually that they were invading Japanese people and Baltic people at the same time. Anyways, whatever, an issue with this is firstly, yes, that could be true, but let's look at the difference between him and Genghis Khan. Yeah, even if he did have his direct bloodline, it might be a little muddled by now. And way more importantly, at this later point in history, a solid 10 million men could also claim this and be absolutely correct. He had like a gazillion wives, were all direct descendants at this point. At this time, news from the east struck the world. The Qin dynasty fell in 1912, and with that, it allowed Outer Mongolia to un-China themselves for the first time in a hot minute. Now, Sternberg's wet dream was here, and he could finally make his Mongol imperialist state a reality. He immediately moved towards Outer Mongolia in the quest to help them in their struggle against Chinese control, aiding the Russian Empire in their protection of the new sovereign Mongol Khanate. It wasn't all sunshine and rainbows for him, as his personal reputation hindered him from joining or leading any Mongolian troops in order to avoid diplomatic problems with China. Unfortunately, Sternberg's fantasies could only be fulfilled for a year, as he had to go fight in the Big Bad War of 1914, or otherwise called World War I. Fighting for the Russian Empire on the Allied side, he was decorated for his bravery in battle and rather unorthodox strategic methods. During his time as cavalry commander on the Austro-Hungarian front, he developed the strong belief that fear was simply a choice, and that a true warrior was immune to bullets. He would frequently charge machine gun nests on horseback with zero cover. If his horse was shot at, which happened plenty of times, then he would simply get off, draw his sword, and continue advancing on foot. It is an absolute miracle that he survived the war when you think about it. But basically, he was much more obsessed with finding a glory-filled death in battle than leading a proper strategic victory. But despite this, he was quite the drunk lad 24/7, and often fought other officers under their influence. The Russian Empire kept the brother around as they needed commanders crazy enough to lead the high-casualty cavalry charges on the Eastern Front. Sternberg only knew of war, recklessness, and the warrior spirit, but upon the fall of the Russian Empire, it made sense why he was a little lost. After losing his first love, the Russian monarchy, he became somewhat of a fanatic. He hated the new Bolshevik revolution, he hated atheists, he hated liberalism, he hated the fucking Oklahoma City Thunder, who knows? This lad Roman was just intense. These ideals he took with him when he joined the White Army, you know, the opposite of red. At this stage, Sternberg's God of War mysticism really began to take place, as he really believed of himself as some sort of reincarnation of the Mongol god of war. Let's see how Outer Mongolia is doing right now. Oh, it's Chinese again. The newly independent Outer Mongolia was invaded by Zhu Shuzheng and the Northwest Frontier Defense Army and forced Outer Mongolia to withdraw from its declaration of autonomy. But it too was also short-lived, as Zhu had to return back to Beijing to deal with typical Chinese warlord politics, leaving his troops in Mongolia without direct leadership. Flash forward a bit and the white movement is getting clapped, and all the anti-Bolshevik leaders that Sternberg relied on are just like gone now. So then he took his lads, the Asiatic cavalry division, away from the White Army into Chinese-occupied Outer Mongolia, where Shu's troops occupied in order to restore the former Khan. After a wild night out in the steppes, he defeated the leaderless Chinese army and took the city of Urga. He then achieved his certainly unique lifelong goal of restoring Bogd Khan, Mongolia's former spiritual king, to the throne, freeing him from Chinese house arrest. This made the Mongolian locals pretty happy, as this crazy fella seemed like some divine liberator sent to restore their independence. His short time as warlord was alright, I guess. He actually, despite his absolute hatred for Western modernity, ran the city of Urga with frantic efficiency. Sternberg ordered the cleanup of the city's sanitation systems and introduced Mongolia's first paper currency. He also established public transport networks and really favoured the spread of native Mongolian culture by opening schools true to the people. Yeah, this guy sounds pretty rad, right? Wrong. He set up a pretty rough secret police to execute those who were suspected of leftist or Bolshevik ideals. It's likely that the many who were killed weren't even leftist or Bolshevik and were just people that Sternberg didn't fancy himself. Many also faced very sadistic torture methods under his second-in-command and chief executioner, including lowering prisoners into pits with man-eating bears and boiling people alive. Sternberg was also a firm believer in eugenics and often enforced barbaric punishments onto those he thought weren't desirable. Some sources even suggest that his second-in-command would just walk around and strangle random old ladies in the street. So you make your call on this guy's leadership. By mid-1921, everyone was just absolutely sick of this fella, and after a failed campaign into Soviet territory by Sternberg, all of his men mutinied. He was surprisingly hard to assassinate and escaped from 2 attempts on his life, which kind of added to his mythic aura. You do have to give him that. Just because he escaped does not mean he survived. One day he ran into some local Mongol soldiers that didn't really like the guy but didn't want to do the deed themselves, so they just crippled him and left.
A few moments later.
Then the Soviets swept the brother up, put him on trial, and it was GG. When he turned the page on his story, it's easy to see the brutality of his life. Yes, he was generally just straight up a terrible guy and led through terror, executions, and racial and religious hatred. But he also drove Chinese occupation forces out of Mongolia, helping them with their struggle against Chinese imperialism. However, the nail in his coffin was that following his removal of Chinese influence in the area, he might have actually paved the way for Soviet influence in Mongolia instead, as without Chinese occupation and following his capture, it was easy for Mongolian communists to consolidate power in Outer Mongolia. He must have been rolling in his grave.